Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Retirement Planning Simplified. I'm Joe Curry, along with my co-host, as always, Lindsay Wilson. How are you, Lindsay?
I'm great, Joe. I'm extremely excited. We're in the middle of our run for Girl in the Goldfish Bowl at Peterborough Theatre Guild. Keep inviting people. If you're in the Peterborough area, come on out and see the show. It's very fun. And it's been going great.
Awesome. I'm glad you guys are getting such great attendance.
Yeah.
And I think I said this last time, but I'm excited to see you this weekend.
Yes. Yeah. On Friday. Yes. I'm very, and I think we mentioned it last time too, but a lot of lovely client support, a lot of those friendly faces there.
Yeah, which is awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So today I thought we would just talk about what happens to our assets when something happens to us. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of people don't understand when they can name a beneficiary, what the will is going to take care of versus what's going to go directly to their kids or whoever their beneficiaries are. So I thought maybe we would kind of just go through some of those kind of more typical or more common assets and just talk about what happens.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So I think we can just start with a very basic question is, can I name my beneficiaries or does it go all to the estate? And in brackets, I don't want to pay probate.
Yeah. So kind of what we mean there is in most cases, people will do anything to not pay probate, right? Mm-hmm. So how can we find a way to get the assets into our beneficiaries' hands as opposed to going through a state where we have to pay probate or a state pays probate before it then goes off to our beneficiaries? And so in most cases where available, we do want to try and avoid probate where we can, but sometimes it's not always the best option. There's other considerations. So how about we just kind of go through those different assets and we'll talk about, the different considerations.
So I think a good place to start might be with some of the registered retirement funds. So looking at, say, RRSP and RIF. This
is actually a perfect example of where, avoiding probate maybe is not always the best idea. But the first thing we're almost always looking at is if you have a spouse. And in that case, what's typically going to happen is your spouse was going to be your beneficiary, and you're going to, if something happens to you, that's going to roll over tax-free to your spouse. So if you take money out of your RSP or if you take money out of your RIF, that goes as income, right? Or it goes on your tax return as income and you pay tax on it. If you don't have a spouse and you pass away, if that goes to your estate, that the whole amount comes out, it's fully taxable, right? So up to half of that amount can go to tax. But as long as you have a spouse and the beneficiary set up, if something happens to you, that would just roll over to your spouse tax-free. And then there's no tax consequences until something happens to them. Now, if you don't have a spouse or your spouse has already passed away, then you can still name a beneficiary on an RSP or a RIF, but whether you want to or not is another question to ask yourself or another decision to make. So if you, let's say you have 3 kids and you put the 3 kids as the beneficiaries. So again, you don't have a spouse or they've already passed away, so you're the survivor. So now this money, you want it to go to the next generation. It can bypass probate. So go outside of the estate to your kids, and they get the full amounts that are in the account. So that's okay. The one downside of that is, though, that all the money's been paid out, but the estate is still on the hook to pay the tax for the money that was in those accounts, right? So if, and I'm using a round number, a high round number, but if $1 million came out of that account and something happens to you, there's going to be roughly $500,000 of tax owing. So if the kids, between the 3 of them, have $1 million, the estate now has to come up with $500,000 to pay that tax. There may be other assets in there. It might not be an issue, but in a lot of cases, what we find, and when we kind of talk about this with clients, is they would rather that just everything, like from that sense, if there's going to be tax on it, it just goes to the estate. Everything, the tax is paid, and then the executor isn't worried about chasing money. They can just divvy up what's like what we call the residual, what's left over to the beneficiaries after that's taken care of. And the cost of maybe keeping things a little simpler and making sure the money there is in Ontario is about 1.5%. Every province is a little bit different, but in Ontario it works out to about 1.5% of the value of those assets. So you can have it go straight to a beneficiary, but you may want to have it go to the estate, again, just depending on your situation. So beyond that, there's other scenarios. So if it goes to your kids and they're adults and just kind of living typical lives, then that's all going to be taxable. Like there's no way to not pay that tax on the surviving spouse, or if you're single when you pass away. But that said, if your kids are dependent on you, financially dependent, and they're minors, in that scenario, the money could go to them tax free, and they would have to buy a term certain annuity. So basically, they buy an annuity that basically pays out that inheritance from the RSP to them until they turn 18. So if they were 15, the next 3 years is going to pay that out. So that's potentially a good strategy from a tax standpoint, because that's all going to be taxed in their hands, and they're probably going to be in a pretty low tax rate. The downside of that, though, is they're getting all that money, maybe a lot sooner, right? So again, you might want to have that go to the estate anyway, and then your will might have trust set up for your kids to make sure they're not getting that money all at 18 or earlier. And so, Lindsay, I don't know about you, and I think I probably said this on the podcast, but if I received all that money at 18, I'm not sure I would have made the best financial decisions.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah.
Now, if you have adult children, they could still be, and this is what we call a qualified beneficiary, where they could receive that money into their own RSP, their own RIF, or potentially a registered disability savings plan, an RDSP. This is if they were dependent on you and have some kind of a disability, right? So their income has to be below a certain threshold. They're dependent on you because of some kind of a disability. So there's some options to move that money tax-free, kind of rolling it over like to a spouse, to those different accounts, if that is the situation. And beyond that, what else do we have? I mean, there's always the option to leave money to charity as well with a named beneficiary, right? So we could name a charity as a beneficiary. As I mentioned, any money when you pass away, if you're the surviving spouse or the only one left, is fully taxable. So up to half, or even more than half, depending on your other income, is taxable when you pass away of the amount of money in that account. So if you left as a beneficiary that money to a charity of your choice, that money could go to the charity. You still have the income and the tax, but then your estate is receiving an offsetting charitable contribution receipt to offset that tax. So those are just some different options, some different considerations to think about depending on your situation and your goals for what could happen with your RRSPs or your RIFs if something happens to you.
Now, if we continue on looking at, say, a LIRA and a LIF, is it similar, different?
Yeah, so it's basically the exact same thing. The difference being, like, so when I say the same thing, I mean the same as an RSP or a RIF, because it is registered retirement money. But you don't have a choice where on the RSP, you don't have to make your spouse the beneficiary. On locked-in money, it's just automatically your spouse is the beneficiary if you have a spouse. Other than that, it's going to be treated the same way.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to move on and look at pensions, because that's a question that we had from a listener a while ago about defined benefit pensions. And if we're looking at pensions, how does that work in terms of a beneficiary, say, looking at a defined contribution?
Yeah, so defined contribution pension plan, this is the one where you put money into it while you're working and your employer is matching those contributions, but you're responsible for the investments, right? There's no guaranteed benefit when you retire. So it works a lot like a group RSP or an RSP. And the outcome is basically the same as the LIRA or the LIF that we just talked about, because that essentially is, to an extent, locked in money. So that works the same. Now, the other type of pension, which is like your government pensions, say OMERS, or your teachers' pensions, this is a defined benefit. So that's where you are going to have a benefit when you retire that is based on a formula. So the risk is on your employer, and they pay, a monthly paycheck for as long as you live, assuming they don't default. Now, if you are receiving your pension income, then your spouse is generally entitled to a survivor benefit. So where we would typically see them get between 50 and 75% of that pension income that you were receiving. Okay. So not typically the full amount. And when you go to retire and you start taking your pension, you usually have some options about what that looks like. So if you have a higher amount of a survivor benefit for your spouse, you're going to have a little bit lower pension amount when you retire. Right. But you make that decision kind of as you go to take the pension. If you have, let's see, Dependent children, then they would receive like a survivor benefit up until they're 18 years old. The estate or designated beneficiaries, they might not receive anything unless you die before retirement. So if you die before retirement, there's going to be some kind of a benefit, like a payout. Or some pensions will have some kind of a guarantee period. I believe like the teacher's pension has like a 10-year guarantee period where there will be something paid out if something happens to you in the first 10 years of your retirement. Mm-hmm. But basically, other than that, like there's no guarantee anything else is getting paid out of that pension.
Right. Now, let's move on and look at a tax-free savings account.
Sure. So tax-free savings accounts, so they're great. You can name a beneficiary on the account, just like your RSP. But the good thing with the tax-free savings account is there's no tax to be paid. So if you name your kids, for example, as beneficiaries, then that money is going to go directly to your kids in a fairly quick manner, and there's going to be no tax to pay. So the estate doesn't have to worry about collecting tax or following up on any of that. That money is just dispersed the exact same way that you put it down your beneficiary designations. Mm-hmm. Now, assuming you have a spouse who's still alive, typically what you want to do is you want to make them the successor annuitant. And what that means is that not only are they the beneficiary, but if you pass away, your entire tax-free savings account is going to move right into their tax-free savings account, and your surviving spouse is going to have their own contribution room plus the contribution room from everything that you moved in when you passed away, right? So it's a way for your spouse to keep a much higher amount of assets within the tax-free savings account, which is great because everything that grows in there is tax-free. Dividends paid out of there, there's no tax paid on. Interest, no tax paid on. So, the more we can utilize that, the better. So important that those beneficiaries are set up properly, again, when your spouse is still alive. I think those are kind of the key things from a beneficiary standpoint on tax-free savings accounts, Lindsay.
And let's look at a non-registered investment accounts as well.
Sure. So typically there is no named beneficiary on a non-registered account. So, we're talking about whether that's your bank account, whether it's a non-registered investment account, that money is going to have to flow through to the estate. And then that's where your will comes in. Your will then, distribute the residual of those assets or whatever's left over. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some potential options to help get maybe some of that outside the estate. So one is using seg funds or segregated funds, which is like a mutual fund with an insurance wrapper on it. Now, on the surface, there's a lot of benefits, and we'll probably do a deeper dive episode on seg funds. But on the surface, there's some benefits to having segregated funds. You have that named beneficiary on there. There are some guarantees that you may or may not ever use. But if you actually look at kind of the additional costs, if the whole idea of trying to have a named beneficiary is to avoid probate, or you're going to end up just paying more than probate in seg fund fees, like the additional costs, right? So if that's the goal, it's not really a viable option, although it is a way to get a named beneficiary. And there might be some scenarios where the goal is not to avoid probate, but you want to get that money into the hands of someone and keep it more private, or just make sure that, there could be different reasons of why you don't want it to go through the will, right? So one of those reasons is anything that is on your will that goes through your estate that's probated is public knowledge, right? So maybe there's some privacy, some other things you're trying to plan for. Maybe you're trying to avoid conflict with your family. Maybe that, you have a few different kids that don't get along, and you just want to get a bunch of the money just sent directly to them and not have them fighting over what's in the estate through the will, right? So there might be some other reasons to use that. We could use trusts. So if it's enough money, it might make sense to move money into a trust. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow you to pass that money on to beneficiaries directly, as opposed to having it go through the estate. So, sometimes seg funds might be a cheaper way to achieve the same thing than using a trust. But again, depending on the situation, how much the value of the assets are and what your goals are, that could be another way of doing it. And then there's certain banks that will allow you up to a certain amount. So one bank we're familiar with will actually, with a death certificate and a copy of the will, they will pay out up to $250,000 directly to the beneficiaries without sending that to the estate. If you want to know what bank that is, you can just shoot us an email, info@retirementplanningsimplified.ca, and we can let you know. Also, if you have a spouse still living, hold your non-registered accounts joint with registered survivorship, because that's just going to roll over tax-free. The ownership just flows fully to your surviving spouse, and there's no tax paid, and it doesn't go to the estate until they pass away. And then one other option is life insurance. So if you have, a lot of money in non-registered accounts that you're paying tax on, that you're eventually going to pass on to the next generation, you don't really want to gift it now for whatever reason, but you're never going to use it. It might make sense to put some of that money into an insurance policy. And the idea being there is you put that in there, you're not paying any tax on it. Something happens to you, you are able to name your beneficiaries, so that flows tax-free to your beneficiaries outside the estate. So there is some, potential benefits to using life insurance for that type of planning. Again, this is going to be if you have money that you're not going to need for your own retirement, right?
Right. I think that dovetails nicely into talking into a larger discussion about life insurance and beneficiaries.
Yeah. So, a lot of people, when they retire, they still have life insurance. When you retire, this is probably the time where you don't need any of your term insurance anymore, assuming you don't have any debt. The kids are out of the house, so they're not dependent on you. You have enough money that you're able to retire, so you don't need that life insurance to make sure there's income there for your spouse. Again, every situation is different, so there could be reasons why you have it. But maybe you still have some permanent life insurance because you want to make sure there's money there for final expenses. You want to do some other planning like I just talked about because you have excess money you're never going to spend. Or you just got it when you were younger and you've kept it and now you might as well keep it because it's going to be tax-free to the kids in the future. So the main thing here is we're talking about beneficiaries and life insurance. You can name almost anybody as a beneficiary to your life insurance. So they have to have an insurable interest on you. So it's going to be someone like a spouse, like your kids, could potentially be other family and friends, depending on the situation. You might leave it to charity, right? So Ash and I actually have, my wife, Ash and I have a policy that we've actually just donated the entire policy to the Peterborough Regional Health Center Foundation. So when we pass away, they'll get all that money. But instead of donating a policy that you don't need, you could also make the charity the beneficiary. So something happens to you, just like with your RIF we talked about. If you put the beneficiary as the charity will send a charitable tax receipt back to your estate. And then if you're a business owner, you might have insurance inside of your company. Maybe it's in your holding company, so you still have it after you're retired. And if it allows you, depending on the type of policy, again, you could have money growing tax-free in there if you're not using it. And then when something happens to you, you would actually make the beneficiary the corporation that's holding it, because what that does is it actually creates some room in the capital dividend account or the CDA. And to try to simplify that, if the money is left to the corporation, then the corporation creates this notional account that just exists on paper. But basically what that means is it allows the majority of that death benefit from the life insurance to flow tax-free out to whoever the beneficiaries are of your estate. And so that is good, because otherwise, if your beneficiaries wanted to take money out of the corporation, they would have to do that and pay tax on it. Right. So there's, a lot of successful business owners have built up these funds in their business that they're never going to spend. So this is one way to get that on a more tax efficient basis out to your family when something happens to you. And then, if you still are in business, there's any kind of succession planning going on, there might be some kind of a buy-sell agreement there where if you pass away, then your partner, your successor has to buy the business from you. But you might have some insurance in place so that if you pass away, they get the money from the insurance so they can then turn around and buy the business from your family, as an example. So that's a lot of different, we dove a little deeper on life insurance probably than I expected. But the point there is, these are common types of assets or products that we see people having, and they often don't know kind of what their options are, what's going to happen to that when they pass away. So hopefully that gives a bit of a better overview so people know what's going to happen to their money or what their options are when something happens to them.
Do you have any action items for the listeners or any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with in terms of beneficiaries?
Yeah, so maybe two things. So number one would be to just kind of get clear on your estate. So hopefully you've done your estate plan, but if you haven't, you can just start with, what do we want to have happen to the money that we have when something happens to us? And then you can start going through those accounts and kind of putting that filter or that process of knowing what your options are to decide what's going to happen on each of those types of accounts. And then the other thing is just use our estate registry if you don't already have something, but also get clear on what are all the different things you have. And if something happens to you, how are people going to find it? How's your executor going to know where it is? So we have the state registry, which we've mentioned many times. If you want a copy, just send us an email, info@retirementplanningsimplified.ca, and we'll send you a copy. And it's really just a place for you to take inventory of everything related to your estate planning so that something happens to you, your executors will have a kind of a running start, so to speak.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Joe, very much.
With that, I guess happy planning and take care. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Investment services are provided through Matthews & Associates Investments of Aligned Capital Partners Incorporated, an approved trade name of Aligned Capital Partners Inc., ACPI. Only investment-related products and services are offered through ACPI/Matthews & Associates Investments of ACPI and covered by the Canadian Investor Protection Fund. Tax planning, financial planning, and insurance services are provided through Matthews & Associates. Matthews & Associates is an independent company separate and distinct from ACPI/Matthews & Associates Investments of ACPI. Matthews & Associates are not licensed tax professionals, and you should consult with your tax advisor before acting on any recommendations.